Okay, natural resources. Let's finish up forestry today. Today, we're going to be looking at some harvesting techniques and we're going to be looking at some replanting techniques that are used and are common in the forestry industry. It's kind of one of those things where I don't want to say it's terribly controversial, but there is some argument over how the or what the best way is of harvesting trees and what the best way is of making sure that we replant and replenish what we have. And so we'll take a look at some different harvesting techniques first, and then we will look at some ways that we can replenish what has been harvested. So uh, intermediate cuttings are going to be cuttings that are made in between the reproduction of the forest and the harvest in the forest. So it kind of more or less what you're doing is you are uh, cutting trees cutting trees out before you harvest the entire forest. So an intermediate cutting is going to be made um, during the growth part of the tree, but before the entire forest is old enough to harvest. So a lot of times, what you're actually doing is you are cutting based on the climate or a tree species. Maybe you have a pine wood forest and you are looking to get the hardwoods out. You've had some hardwoods that have been seeded because of birds or something like that, and you want to get the hardwoods out of there. Or maybe you have a hardwood forest and you're trying to take the conifers out, the evergreens, the pines. So typically, whenever you're doing one of these intermediate cuttings, you are not actually removing the entire forest. You are removing a certain part of it in order to achieve a certain objective. There are several different ways to do that. A thinning is going to be when you're removing some of the trees, and typically what this is doing is you are actually just taking some of the trees out that you don't want in there for whatever reason, and you're giving the other trees room to grow. Um, it's kind of it's honestly it's kind of like what we've done with the cohorts A and B. We've divided everything up and we've put you into smaller groups so that you can thrive and stay healthy and safe. And so that's what we're looking at whenever we're talking about thinning is if you go into a forest and it's very dense and there's a lot of stuff in there, you might want to pull some things out so that everything has room to grow, whether it be the canopies or roots or whatever. You're going to take out things that are disease, things that are undesirable, things that maybe are not growing as well, or maybe they're even hindering something else from being able to grow as well. It's just going to help to reduce the competition of the trees for the resources that are there. Sometimes you might actually remove some of the taller trees, some of the more dominant trees, and let the smaller ones grow, and that is called liberation. It's kind of like if you think about, little kids being liberated from their classrooms or parents or whatever. You're letting the little kids go and grow, and you're getting rid of the big stuff. And so the liberation is more or less taking out the taller stuff, the older stuff, the stuff that's not going to do much else, and you're giving the younger stuff an opportunity to be able to grow. Sanitation cuttings are basically going to clean things up. A lot of times, this is done after you've had disease issues or after you have had even possibly a tornado or hurricane or something like that, and you've got damaged trees. So, sanitation is more or less just to clean up a particular area and get things out of there that are no longer desirable in the particular forest stand. You can see right here, this is an example of an intermediate cutting. And up here at the top, there's a lot of crowding. Nothing necessarily wrong with it. They're not so crowded that they can't grow. But there's a lot of stuff going on there. And so when you look at the bottom picture, everything has more room to grow. Everything has got more space. You're taking out some of the smaller stuff that is going to probably get crowded out anyway, and they're competing for resources, and you are making it to where it is just um, thinner, and that everything has got better access. Everything that you have left has got better access to resources. Salvage cutting. These are some other types of intermediate cutting. Salvage cutting is going to remove anything that's dead or damaged by storms. Also, a lot like sanitation cutting, but salvage, you are trying to save as much as you can. Hence the term salvage. You're trying to salvage what you can. Um, a lot of times, you want to make sure that you are getting rid of things that are not going to be harvestable. Trees that are forked, maybe they got broken early on and they formed a fork. A lot of times, those trees are not going to be marketable just because they're not going to be big enough to be marketable. And so, you want to get rid of those. If they're crooked, they're not going to be as marketable because people do not want crooked lumber. Even if you're just looking again at something like pines and a hardwood stand, you want to remove anything that's just undesirable in there. Um, One thing that is often done in the forestry industry, and you're actually hearing a lot about this right now because of the wildfires that are out in California and on the West Coast, is prescription burns. And one thing that the Forestry Service will do from time to time, especially in managed forest, is they will do what's called a prescribed burn. And literally, there is somebody there on site. It's done under certain weather conditions. You can't do it when it's super dry or windy or anything like that. The weather conditions have to be right. And they literally will go around the edge of the forest with a drip torch, and that drip torch will drop fuel and fire along the edge of the forest. Typically, they're going to burn it inward toward the edge of the forest so that they're not burning outward to other parts of the forest or field. And they're literally just burning the undergrowth. It doesn't hurt the trees, it just burns the undergrowth so that it's not something that's going to be more dangerous in the long run and potentially cause issues with wildfires. The problem that they're having right now in California is there is a lot of undergrowth in these forests, and they are federally managed forests. And so that is where the federal government should be coming in and doing these prescribed burns. California has a lot of environmental laws, and the state itself is not responsible for the federal forest. And so there's a little bit of a power struggle going on as to who's actually responsible for taking care of these things and keeping them managed. Where the federal government is saying it's the state's responsibility, but the state is saying that it's the federal government's responsibility because they're federal forests. So there's a little bit of back and forth on that right now, but in the meantime, it's making for a very dangerous situation in the forest in the western part of the United States. You can see here the what a prescribed burn actually does. And so you've got the before over here. You have lots of uh, underbrush, lots of small trees, lots of weeds, and you would go into this particular forest. Somebody would come along the edge of the forest with a drip torch and go around the boundaries of where you wanted to set the fire. The fire would burn inward, and this is sometime after a prescribed burn. So this particular picture here, yes, there is still some undergrowth here, but this undergrowth is green, much less likely to catch fire. And it would eventually have to have another prescribed burn at some point, but it does help in the short term to be able to clear up any debris and undergrowth and make it more manageable. As far as harvest cuttings, so in the past slides, we've been talking about intermediate cuttings. Those are cuttings that you're going to do without taking down the whole forest. Whenever you're harvesting trees, though, you want to look at different methods of harvesting and getting rid of trees. So with harvesting cuttings, um, selective cutting is one way to do it. You actually are picking individual trees that you want to cut out. We have had that done on my family's farm years ago, and I remember the logging foreman coming through with tape and measuring the trees and actually putting uh, plastic tape around the trees that they wanted to cut down, and they selected the ones they wanted to get rid of. It does help to improve the forest, and what you're more or less doing is taking out the stuff that's ready to be harvested and potentially leaving the younger stuff so that it can be harvested later on. A lot of times they'll do what's called shelter wood cutting, where you're actually not taking everything all at one time, which is called clear cutting. And clear cutting just kind of makes things sad and ugly looking. Shelter wood, a lot of times they are leaving some trees in the forest for shelter, and they'll come back at another time and take some more of those trees. They're actually removing it in stages and not just everything all at one time, which is better for wildlife because it still gives them a habitat in order to be able to survive. Seed tree cutting is where you would take everything except for a certain number of trees or a certain type of tree that you want to reseed your forest with. So let's say, for instance, that you want to have a forest that's mostly oaks. And so you would go into that forest and you would take out everything except for several of the oaks that you would want to replenish the population. So you're going to take everything except for, the seed trees that you want to keep, so that they can reseed the area. Um, Coppice cutting is very much like the seed tree cutting, except for the remaining trees are going to actually develop roots and suckers. It's just a different type of tree. They're trees that reproduce better by using suckers and root cuttings more than actual seeds. So it kind of just depends on the type of tree that you're wanting to keep there. This is clear cutting. Um, yes, it's the most economical. However, this is ugly and it does a lot to damage the land. And it really just kind of strips all the nutrients at one time, and it makes a mess. There's a lot of issues with erosion with clear cutting. With clear cutting, you are taking everything all at one time. It is economical because you don't have to worry about going through and picking stuff and moving around trees and pulling stuff around trees. Um, However, it does strip the forest bare and it leaves it pretty ugly, until you can get something planted back in that particular area. So as we're reproducing, there's several different ways to do that. The easiest and cheapest way to do it is natural seeding. The problem with natural seeding is you get what you get. And so whatever seeds come up is what you're going to have. Now, a lot of that has to do with whatever seeds are already there and what wildlife actually brings into the area, because a lot of times you have birds that will eat seeds, and then they will go somewhere else and they will deposit those seeds. And so it kind of just depends on what you have around, what you're actually going to get reseeded with. It is an inexpensive way to do it. It's a free way to do it, to be perfectly honest. But there is not a whole lot of control over what you're going to get. Direct seeding is where you're actually going to apply seeds to the area. And you can actually see this tractor here. There's several different ways of doing it. You can do hand seeding and mechanical seed spreaders like you would use in your yard. But you can also use a grain drill like you would do with a grain crop and actually plant the seeds, or you can drop the seeds from aircraft. This is going to be a little bit more expensive, of course, because you actually are having to purchase the seeds and have somebody distribute those seeds. But there is still an element of germination and whether the seeds are actually coming up. The most surefire way of getting what you want is to go and get seedlings. There are forestry nurseries that are located around the state where they actually plant trees, and they have these seedlings and saplings that you can purchase and you can plant them. It is more labor intensive because you have to go and pick up the trees and you have to have somebody that can actually go and plant the trees. They typically will use what's called a planting bar, and that planting bar will be used to make a hole in the ground. You put the tree seedling in, and then you're just going to step on it and close the hole back up. It does give you more control over what you have in the stand of forest. you do get results more quickly a lot of times because you don't have to worry about whether or not the seeds are actually going to germinate because they're already started. There are some governments that um, will help to give people incentives to plant the trees back once they've harvested. They will give you money back in order to be able to get you to plant those forests for future use. So it kind of just depends on where you're at and what your state actually does. I do know that North Carolina does give some breaks to landowners who reseed. But this is going to be the most certain way to make sure that you have got trees and trees that you want, because we do want to look at the future and who is actually going to be able to harvest these at some point. And there is just a picture of some planting of seedlings. So that is it for forestry. Next time we will start looking at soil and water, and hopefully if you have any questions about forestry, you will get in touch with me. I will see you guys very soon.